actually open up another. Offset. Okay. We finished the state versus liberty, which underwhelming part, honestly. Like, yeah, they're right, but also, um, part three just so obviously follows from part two that it feels a bit redundant to say it. Gotta, because it's systematic, but you know. Yeah, now we're part four, modern alternative theories of liberty, and we're gonna try and finish the section. I don't know. Also, I'm gonna get the music going. Um, how's the volume? It could be louder. That seems good. I don't want to be too loud. And just making sure that stuff's set up. Good. Yeah, so more economics. It's been a week since I need to get better at streaming consistently, but I'm always so low energy after work. Also, the weather is we're at a haze right now. 11 degrees haze. Strange weather for it to say. I've never seen that before. Yeah. Anyway, part 4, modern alternative theories of liberty. Because we've already we've critiqued the state, but it doesn't make any sense to critique the state and not then propose an alternative. Fair enough. Having presented our theory of liberty and property rights, discuss the inherent role of the state vis-a-vis liberty. We turn in this part of the work to a discussion and critique of several leading alternative theories of liberty brought forth in the modern world by those who are very roughly in the free market or classical liberal tradition. So we're gonna get. I feel like it's gonna be scathing because the word very roughly words, whatever the other merits of these theories, they will be seen to provide a flawed and inadequate foundation for a systematic theory of liberty and the rights of the individual. So, 26. Utilitarian free market economics. A. Introduction. Utilitarian social philosophy. I hope that was loud. Economics emerged as a distinct self-conscious science of the 19th century, and hence this development unfortunately coincided with the dominance of utilitarianism in philosophy. Social philosophy of economists, therefore, whether the laissez-faire creed of the 19th century, statism of the 20th, has almost invariably been grounded in utilitarian social philosophy. Even today, political economy abounds with discussion of the weighing of social costs, social benefits, in deciding upon public policy. We cannot engage here in a critique of utilitarianism as an ethical theory. Here we are interested in analyzing certain attempts to use a utilitarian ethic to provide a defensible groundwork for a libertarian or laissez-faire ideology. Our brief criticisms will concentrate then on utilitarianism insofar as it has been used as a groundwork for a libertarian or quasi-libertarian political philosophy. In brief, utilitarian social philosophy holds the good policy to be the one that yields the greatest good for the greatest number, which each person counts for one in making up that number, and in which the good is held to be the fullest satisfaction of the purely subjective desires of the individuals in society. Utilitarians, like economists, see further below, like to think of themselves as scientific and value-free, and their doctrine supposedly permits them to adopt a virtually value-free stance. They are presumably not imposing their own values, but simply recommending the greatest satisfaction of the desires and wants of the mass of the population. But this doctrine is hardly scientific, and by no means value-free. For one thing, why the greatest number? Why is it ethically better to follow the wishes of the greater as against the lesser number? What's so good about the greatest number? Considering criticisms of utilitarian approaches in the work, see 11 to 13 above. And what if, even in utilitarian terms, more happiness can be obtained by following the wishes of the smaller number? For a discussion of this problem, see Peter Geach, The Virtues. Be fun. I'm not going to read it though. Suppose that the vast majority of people in a society hate and revile redheads, and greatly desire to murder them. And suppose further that there are only a few redheads extant at any time. Must we then say it is good for the vast majority to see redheads? And if not, why not? At the very least then, utilitarianism scarcely suffices to make a case for liberty and laissez-faire. As Felix Adler wryly put it, utilitarians pronounce the greatest happiness of the greatest number to be the social end, although they failed to make it intelligible why the happiness of the greater number should be cogent as an end upon those who happen to belong to the lesser number. Secondly, what is the justification for each person counting for one? Why not some system of weighting? This, too, seems to be an unexamined and therefore unscientific article of faith in utilitarianism. Thirdly, why is the good only fulfilling the subjective emotional desires of each person? Why can there be no supra-subjective critique of these desires? Indeed, utilitarianism implicitly assumes the subjective desires, absolute givens, which the social technician is somehow duty-bound to try to satisfy. But it is common human experience that individual desires are not absolute and they are not hermetically sealed off from persuasion, rational or otherwise. Experience and other individuals can and do persuade and convince people to change their value. But how could that be so if all individual desires and values are pure givens and therefore not subject to alteration by the intersubjective persuasion of others? But if these desires are not givens, and they are changeable by the persuasion of moral argument, it would then appear that intersubjective moral principles do exist that can be argued and can have an impact on others. Oddly enough, while utilitarianism assumes that morality, the good, is purely subjective to each individual, it assumes, on the other hand, that these subjective desires can be added, subtracted, and weighed across the various individuals in society. It assumes that individual subjective utilities and costs can be added, subtracted, and measured so as to arrive at a net social utility or social cost, thus permitting the utilitarian to advise for or against a given social policy. Storage space. I guess we'll add at some point. Modern welfare economics is particularly adept at arriving at estimates, even allegedly precise quantitative ones, of social cost and social utility. But economics does correctly inform us not that moral principles are subjective, but that utilities and costs are indeed subjective. Individual utilities are purely subjective and ordinal, and therefore it is totally illegitimate to add or weight them to arrive at any estimate for social utility or cost. B. The unanimity and compensation principle. Utilitarian economists, even more than their philosophic confreres, I don't know that word, sorry, are eager to make scientific and value-free pronouncements on public policy, believing, however, that ethics are purely arbitrary and subjective. How may economists then take policy positions? This chapter will explore ways in which utilitarian free market economists presume to favor a free market while attempting to refrain from one important utilitarian variant is the unanimity principle, based on the criterion of Pareto optimality. That checks out. Because they mentioned in an earlier chapter about all uses of the economic means to all uses of the economic means to make yourself wealthier, Pareto optimal, because the other person, well, presuming that the other person is acting rationally. If the other person is acting irrationally, you can't assume that. You can't assume that they're always acting, but if two people rationally decide to engage in some market action, it has an expected Pareto optimality. Anyway, one important utilitarian variant is the unanimity principle, based on the criterion of optimality. A political policy is good if one or more people are better off that policy, while no one is worse off. A strict version of Pareto optimality implies unanimity that every person agrees to, hence believes that he will be better off, or at least no worse off, from a particular government action. In recent years, the unanimity principle as groundwork for a free market of voluntary and contractual has been stressed by Professor James Buchanan. I think he was mentioned. Buchanan? Anyway, mentioned in. I think Hopper talked about him at length. Unanimity principle has great attractions for value-free economists eager to make policy judgments. For far more than in the case of mere majority rule, will the economist safely advocate a policy if everyone in the society favors it. While the unanimity principle may at first appear superficially attractive to liberty, however, there is at its heart a vital and irredeemable flaw, that the goodness of free contracts or unanimously approved changes from the existing situation depends completely on the goodness or justice of that existing situation itself. Yet neither Pareto optimality nor its unanimity principle variation can say anything about the goodness or justice of the existing status quo, concentrating as they do solely on changes from that situation, or 0 point. Not only that, but the requirement of unanimous approval of changes necessarily freezes the existing status quo. If the status quo is unjust or repressive of liberty, then the unanimity principle is a grave barrier to justice and liberty, rather than a bulwark on its behalf. The economist who advocates the unanimity principle as a seemingly value-free pronouncement for liberty is instead making a massive and totally unsupported value judgment on behalf of free status quo. The commonly accepted compensation principle variant of Pareto optimality contains all the flaws of the strict unanimity principle while adding many of its own. The compensation principle asserts that a public policy is good if the gainers from that policy can compensate the losers and still enjoy net gains, so that while there are losers in utility from this policy at the beginning, there are no such losers after the compensation takes. But the compensation principle assumes that it is conceptually possible to add and subtract utilities personally, and thereby to measure gains and losses. It also assumes that each individual's gain and losses can be precisely estimated, but economics informs us that utility, and hence gains and losses in utility, are purely subjective and psychic concepts, and that they cannot possibly be measured or even estimated by outside observers. Gains and losses in utility, therefore, cannot be added, measured, or weighted against each other, and much less can precise compensations be discovered. The usual assumption by economists is to measure psychic losses in utility by the monetary price of an act. Yeah. Thus, if a railroad damages the land of a farmer by smoke, it is assumed by the compensationist that the farmer's loss can be measured by the market price of the land, but this assumption ignores that the farmer may well have a psychic attachment to that land far greater than the market price, and that, furthermore, it is impossible to find out what the farmer's psychic attachment to the land may be. Asking the farmer is useful. May say, for example, that his attachment to the land is much higher than the market price, but he may well be lying. The government or other outside observer has no way of finding out one way or the other. This is read the footnote here. Individuals demonstrate part of their utility rankings when they take free market exchange. But government actions, of course, are non-market phenomena. For a further analysis of this question, see Walter Block. Praxeology, value judgments. That sounds fun. Anyway. Furthermore, the existence in the society of just one militant anarchist whose psychic grievance against government is such that he cannot be compensated for his psychic disutility from the existence or activity of government is enough by itself to destroy the compensation case for any government action whatsoever, and surely at least one such anarchist exists. A stark but not atypical example of the fallacies and the unjust devotion to the status quo of the compensation principle was the debate in the British Parliament during the early 19th century on the abolition of slavery. The early adherents of the compensation principle were there maintaining that the masters must be compensated for the loss of their investment in slaves, at which point Benjamin Pearson, a member of the Libertarian Manchester, declared that he had thought it was the slaves who should have been compensated. Precisely, here is a striking example of in advocating public policy to have some ethical system, some concept of justice. Those of us ethicists told that slavery is criminal and unjust would always oppose the idea of compensating the masters and would rather think in terms of requiring the masters to compensate the slaves for their years of oppression. But the value-free economist, resting on the unanimity and compensation principle, is, on the contrary, implicitly placing his unsupported and arbitrary value imprimatur on the unjust status quo. Is in a fascinating exchange with a critic of the unanimity principle. I hate that word, it is a tongue twister for me. Unanimity. Professor Buchanan concedes that I am defending the status quo, not because I like it, I do not, but my defense of the status quo stems from my unwillingness, indeed inability, to discuss changes other than those that are contractual in nature. I can, of course, lay down my own notion, but to me, this is simply wasted effort. Thus, tragically, Buchanan, admitting that his idea of ethics is one of purely subjective and arbitrary notions, is yet willing to promulgate what can be an equally subjective and arbitrary on his own grounds, defense of the status quo. Now, Buchanan concedes that his procedure does allow me to take a step toward normative judgments or hypotheses, namely to suggest that the changes seem to be able to everyone. Pareto-efficient changes must, of course, include compensation. The criterion in my scheme is agreement. But what is the... Hey, hello, I was thinking what is it called? The C with the tail. It makes a sis sound. I was very confused by there being two of them. I've only ever seen them one at a time. I took French in high school, intermediate as well. I was never very good at it. How's it going, Sir Zenta? We are reading something very dry, very dusty. Talking about what was the premise again? The unanimity and compensation principle. So it's a critique of those within utilitarian social philosophy. I remember in Democracy of the God That Failed, I'm pretty sure Hopper has a whole section beefing with Buchanan, which was quite fun. It is very interesting. I mean, I'm not expecting for many people to watch. It's just a way for me to actually get around to reading this stuff. Which I will get back to reading. Although I'll try to respond to your messages when I see them. Anyway, but what is the agreement for this limited step? What's so great about agreement on changes from a possibly unjust status quo? Isn't such a limited step also an arbitrary notion, Buchanan? And if willing to proceed to such an unsatisfactory limit, why not go still further to question status quo? Great, be good if you hang around. Buchanan proceeds to assert that our task is really that of trying to find, locate, invent schemes that can command unanimous or quasi-unanimous consent and propose them. What in the world is quasi-unanimity? Fun question. Since persons disagree on so much, these schemes may be a very limited set. and this may suggest to you that few changes are possible, hence the status quo defended indirectly. Status quo has no propriety at all, save for its existence, and it is all that exists. The point I always emphasize is that we start from here and not from somewhere else. Here one longs for Lord Acton's noble dictum. Liberalism wishes for what ought to be, irrespective of what is. Buchanan's critic, though far from a libertarian or a free market liberal, here probably has the last word. I certainly do not totally object to seeking contractual solutions, but I do think that they can't be projected in a vacuum that allows the status quo power structure to go unspecified and unexamined. Section C. Ludwig von Mises and value-free laissez-faire. Ooh. Actual libertarian infighting. Let's go. Because, Mises is well regarded, actually, generally. Let us now turn to the position of Ludwig von Mises on the entire matter of praxeology, value judgments, and the advocacy of public policy. The case of Mises is particularly interesting, for he was, of all the economists in the 20th century, at one and the same time the most uncompromising and passionate adherent of laissez-faire, and the most rigorous and uncompromising advocate of value-free economics, and opponent of any sort of objective ethics. How then did he attempt to reconcile these two positions? Mises offered two separate and very different solutions to the problem. The first is a variant of the unanimity principle. Essentially, this variant affirms that an economist per se cannot say that a given governmental policy is good or bad. However, if a given policy will lead to consequences as explained by praxeology, which every one of the supporters of the policy will agree is, then the value-free economist is justified in calling the policy a bad one. Okay. That's broadly my inclination, I think. So, like, you know, if a policy killed everyone, for example, you can infer that it's a bad policy because you can, figure out from praxeology that people don't want to die. From the fact that they continue to go on living. Using a very extreme example here. Anyway, thus Mises writes, an economist investigates whether a measure A can bring about the result P. Nice. We are sort of in the third quarter of the book. An economist investigates whether a measure A can bring about the result P, for the attainment of which it is recommended, and finds that A does not result in P, but in G, an effect which even the supporters of the measure A consider undesirable. If the economist states the outcome of his investigation by saying that A is a bad measure, he does not pronounce a judgment of value. He merely says that, from the point of view of those aiming at the goal P, measure A is inappropriate. And again, economics does not say that government interference with the prices of only one commodity unfair, bad, or unfeasible. It says that it makes conditions worse, not better, from the point of view of the government and those backing its interference. Now, this is surely an ingenious attempt to allow pronouncements of good or bad by the economist without making a value judgment. For the economist is supposed to be only a praxeologist, technician, pointing out to his readers or listeners that they will all consider a policy bad once he reveals consequences. But ingenious as it is, the attempt completely fails. For how does Mises know what the advocates of the particular policy are desirable? How does he know what their value scales are now or what they will be when the consequences of the measure appear? One of the great contributions of praxeological economics is that the economist realizes that he doesn't know what anyone's value scales are, except as those value preferences are demonstrated by a person's concrete action. Mises himself emphasized that one must not forget that the scale of values or what manifests itself only in the reality of action. These scales have no independent existence apart from the actual behavior of individuals. Only source from which our knowledge concerning these scales is derived is the observation of a man's action. Every action is always in perfect agreement with the scale of values or because these scales are nothing but an interpretation of man's acting. I guess analytically that's true. Although, there's interiority to it, like there's a way you value things in your head, but then there is the way that those values manifest through your action. And praxeologically, when you take action that when you take action that does demonstrate what you value, regardless of what you think you value, the sort of rubber hits the road thing. Given Mises's own analysis, then, how can the economist know what the motives for advocating various policies really are, or how people will regard the consequences of these policies? Thus, Mises, qua economist, may show that price control, to use his example, will lead to unforeseen shortages of a good to the consumers. But how does Mises know that some advocates of price control want shortages? They may, for example, be socialists anxious to use the step to full collectivism. Some may be egalitarians who prefer shortages because the rich will not be able to use their money to buy more of the product than poorer people. Some may be nihilists, eager to see the shortages of goods. Others may be one of the numerous legion of contemporary intellectuals who are eternally complaining about the excessive affluence of our society, or about the great waste of energy. They may all delight in the shortages of goods. Still others may favor price control even after learning of the shortages, because they, or their political allies, will enjoy well-paying jobs of power in the price control bureaucracy. All sorts of such possibilities exist, and none of them is compatible with Mises asserting, as a value-free economist, that all the supporters of the price control, or of any other government intervention, must concede after learning economics that the measure is bad. In fact, once Mises concedes that even a single advocate of price control, any other interventionist measure, may acknowledge the economic consequences and still favor it for whatever reason, then Mises, as a praxeologist and economist, can no longer call any of these measures bad or good, even appropriate or inappropriate, without inserting into his economic policy announcement the very value judgment that Mises himself holds to be inadmissible in a scientist of human action. For then he is no longer being a technical reporter to all advocates of a certain policy, but himself an advocate participating on one side of a value conflict. Moreover, there is another fundamental reason for advocates of inappropriate policy to refuse to change their minds even after hearing and acknowledging the praxeological chain of consequences. For praxeology may indeed show that all types of government policies will have consequences that most people, at least, tend to abhor. However, and this is a vital qualification, most of these consequences take time, some a great deal of time. Ooh, time preference time. Time preferences are one of those very rich aspects of economics. Great to argue around. No economist has done more than Ludwig von Mises to elucidate the universality of time preference in affairs. The praxeological law that everyone prefers to attain a given satisfaction sooner than later, and certainly Mises, as a value-free scientist, never presumed to criticize anyone's rate of time preference. To say that A's was too high or B's too low. But in that case, what about the high time preference people in society may retort to the praxeology? Perhaps this high tax and subsidy policy will lead to a decline of capital, perhaps even the price control shortages, but I don't care. Having a high time preference, I value more highly the short-run subsidy, short-run enjoyment of buying the current good at cheaper prices than the prospect of suffering the future consequences. And Mises, as a value-free scientist and opponent of any concept of objective ethics, cannot call. There is no way that he can assert the superiority of the long run over the short run without overriding the values of the high time preference people, and this cannot be cogently done without abandoning his own subjectivist ethics. In this connection, one of Mises's basic arguments for the free market is that on the market there is a harmony of the rightly understood interests of all people of the market society. It is clear from his discussion that he doesn't merely mean interest, after learning that praxeological consequence of market activity or of government intervention. He also, and in particular, means people's long-run interest, or, as Mises states, for rightly understood interest, he may as well say interests in the long run. But what about the high time preference? Prefer to consult their short-run interests. How can the long run be called better than the short run? Why must right understanding necessarily be the long run? See, therefore, that Mises' attempt to advocate laissez-faire while remaining value-free, by assuming that all of the advocates of government will abandon their position once they learn of its consequences, falls completely to the ground. There is another and very different way, however, that Mises attempts to reconcile his passionate advocacy of laissez-faire with the absolute value freedom of the scientist. This is to take a position much more compatible with praxeology, by recognizing that the economist qua economist can only trace chains of cause and effect and may not engage in value judgments or advocate public policy. This route of Mises concedes that the economic scientist cannot advocate laissez-faire, but then adds that he as a citizen can do so. As a citizen then proposes a value system, but it is a curiously scanty one, for he is here caught in a dilemma. As a praxeologist, knows that he cannot, as an economic scientist, pronounce value judgments or advocate policy, Yet he cannot bring himself simply to assert and inject arbitrary value judgments, and so, as a utilitarian, for Mises, along with most economists, is indeed a utilitarian in ethics, though a Kantian in epistemology. What he does is to make only one narrow value judgment, that he desires to fulfill the goals of the majority of the public. Happily, in this formulation, Mises does not presume to know the goals of everyone. As Mises explains in his second variant, liberalism, i.e. laissez-faire liberalism, is a political doctrine. As a political doctrine, liberalism, in contrast to economic science, is not neutral with regard to values and ultimate ends by action. It assumes that all men, or at least the majority of people, are intent upon attaining certain goals. It gives them information about the means suitable to realization of their plan. I had to pass that for a moment. The champions of liberal doctrine are fully aware of the fact that their teachings are valid only for people who are committed to their valuational principles, while praxeology, and therefore economics too, the term happiness, removal of uneasiness, in a purely formal sense, liberalism attaches to deep meaning. It presupposes that people prefer life to death, health to sickness, abundance to poverty, teaches men how to act in accordance with the valuations. In this second variant, Mises has successfully escaped the self-contradiction of being a value-free praxeologist, advocating laissez-faire. Granting in this variant, the economist may not make such advocacy, takes his stand as a citizen willing to make value judgment, but he is not willing to simply assert an ad hoc value. Presumably, he feels that a valuing intellectual must present some sort of ethical by such value judgment. But as a utilitarian, Mises' system is a curiously bloodless one. Even as a valuing laissez-faire liberal, he is only willing to make the one value judgment, that he joins the majority of his favoring their common peace, prosperity, and abundance. In this way, as an opponent of objective ethics, and uncomfortable as he must be with making value judgments as a citizen, makes the minimal possible degree of such judgment. True to his utilitarian position, his value judgment is the desirability of fulfilling the subjectively desirable goals of the bulk of the populace. A few points in critique of this position may here be made. In the first place, while praxeology can indeed demonstrate that laissez-faire will lead to harmony, prosperity, and abundance, whereas government intervention leads to conflict and impoverishment, and while it is probably true that most people value the former highly, it is not true that these are their only goals or values. Great analysts of ranked value scales and diminishing marginal utility have been more aware of such competing values and goals. For example, many people, whether through envy or a misplaced theory of justice, may prefer far more equality of income that will be attained on the free market. Many people, pace aforementioned intellectual, may want less abundance in order to whittle down our allegedly excessive affluence. Others, as we have mentioned above, may prefer to loot the capital of the rich or the businessman in the short run while acknowledging but dismissing long run ill effects, because they have a high time preference. Probably very few of these people want to push status measures to the point of total impoverishment and destruction, although this may well happen. But a majority coalition of the above might well opt for some reduction in prosperity on behalf of these other values. They may well decide that it is worth sacrificing a modicum of wealth and production because of the high opportunity cost of not being able to enjoy an negation of envy or a lust for power or power, or, for example, the thrill of national unity they might enjoy from a short-lived economic crisis. Ooh. What can Mises reply to a majority of the public have indeed considered all the praxeological consequences and still prefer a modicum, for that matter, even a drastic amount, statism, in order to achieve some of their competing? As a utilitarian, he cannot quarrel with the ethical nature of their chosen goal, for, as a utilitarian, he must confine himself to the one value judgment that favors the majority achieving their chosen goals. The only reply that Mises can make in his own framework is to point out that government intervention has a cumulative effect, that eventually the economy must move either toward the free market or toward socialism, which praxeology shows will bring chaos and drastic impoverishment, at least to an industrial society. But this too is not a fully satisfactory answer. While many or most programs of status intervention, especially price control, are indeed cumulative, others are not. Furthermore, the cumulative impact takes such a long time preferences of the majority might well lead them, in full acknowledgement of the consequences, to ignore the effect. And then what? Mises attempted to use a cumulative argument to answer the contention that the majority of the public prefer egalitarian measures even knowingly at the expense of a portion of their own wealth. Mises's comment was that the reserve fund was on the point of being exhausted, and therefore that any further egalitarian measures have to come directly out of the pockets of the masses, taxation. Mises assumed that once this became clear, the masses would no longer support measures, but in the first place, this is not a strong argument against the previous egalitarian measures, nor in favor of their repeal. But secondly, while the masses might well be certainly no apodictic certainty involved, and the masses have certainly in the past, and presumably will in the future, continue knowingly to support egalitarian and other statist measures on behalf of others of their goals, despite the knowledge that their income and wealth would be reduced. Thus, Dean Rappard pointed out in his thoughtful critique, does the British voter favor confiscatory taxation of large income, primarily in the hope that it will redound to his advantage, or in the certainty that it will tend to reduce unwelcome and irritating social inequalities? In general, is the urge towards equality in our modern democracies not often stronger than the desire to improve one's material lot? And on his own country, Switzerland, Dean Rappard pointed out that the urban industrial and commercial majority of the country have repeatedly and often at popular referenda endorsed measures to subsidize the minority of farmers in a deliberate effort to retard industrialization and the growth of their own income. Rappard noted that the urban majority did not do so in the absurd belief that they were thereby increasing their real income. Instead, quite deliberately and expressly, political parties have sacrificed the immediate welfare of their members in order to prevent, or at least somewhat to retard, the complete industrialization of the a more agricultural Switzerland, though poorer, such is the dominant wish of the Swiss people. The point here is that Mises, not only as a praxeologist, but even as a utilitarian liberal, can have no word of criticism against these statist measures once the majority of the people have taken their praxeological consequences into account and chosen them anyway on behalf of goals other than wealth and prosperity. Furthermore, there are other types of statist intervention which clearly have little or no cumulative, and which may even have very little effect in diminishing production or prosperity. Let us, for example, assume again, and this assumption is not very far-fetched in record, that the great majority of society hate and revile redheads. Let us further assume that there are very few redheads in society. This large majority then decides that it would very much to murder all redheads. Here they are. Murder of redheads is high on the value scales of the great majority of the public. There are few redheads, so that there will be little loss in production on the market. How can Mises rebut this proposed policy either as a praxeologist or as a utilitarian? I submit that he cannot do so. Mises makes one further attempt to establish his, but it is even less successful, criticizing the arguments for state intervention on behalf of equality or other moral concerns. Dismisses them as emotional after reaffirming that praxeology and economics are neutral in regard to any debts, and asserting that the fact that the immense majority of men prefer a rich supply of material to a less ample supply is a datum of it does not have any place in economic theory. He concludes by insisting that he who disagrees with the teachings of economics ought to refute them by discursive reason, not by the appeal to arbitrary, allegedly ethical standards. But I submit that this will not do, for Mises must concede that no one can decide upon any policy whatever unless he makes an ultimate ethical or value judgment. But since this is so, and since according to Mises all ultimate value judgments or ethical standards are arbitrary, how then can he denounce these particular ethical judgments as arbitrary? Furthermore, it is hardly correct for Mises to dismiss these judgments as emotional, since for him as a utilitarian, reason cannot establish ultimate ethical principles, which can therefore only be established by subjective emotions. It is pointless for Mises to call for his critics to use discursive reasoning. He himself denies that discursive reasoning can ever be used to establish ultimate ethical values. Furthermore, the man whose ultimate ethical principles would market should also be dismissed by Mises as arbitrary and emotional, even if he has taken the laws of praxeology into account before making his ultimate. And we have seen above that the majority of the public very often has other goals which they hold, at least to a certain extent, higher than their own material well-being. Thus, while praxeological economic theory is extremely useful in providing data and knowledge, framing economic policy, it cannot be sufficient by itself to enable the economist to make any value pronouncement or to advocate any public policy whatsoever. More specifically, Ludwig von Mises, to the contrary notwithstanding, neither praxeological economics nor Mises's utilitarian liberalism is sufficient to make the case for laissez-faire market economy. To make such a case, one must go beyond economics and utilitarianism, establish an objective ethics which affirms the overriding value of liberty and morally condemns all forms of statism, from egalitarianism to the murder of redheads, as well as such goals as the lust for power and the satisfaction of envy. Make the full case for liberty, one cannot be a methodological slave to every goal that the majority of the might happen to choose. These are pretty. These next two are pretty short, but then Nozick, Robert Nozick. Oh no. Last time Nozick came up, it was sort of a pain. I didn't like that chapter. It was very abrasive. It was abrasively written. I liked the chapter, but I also didn't like it in a way. Anyway, Isaiah Berlin on negative freedom. Negative freedom is one of those things that's like, it's a framework. It's not really like a thing. It's just like a way he'll talk. It's the issue is, yeah, the issue is that liberty, it's nebulous. You need to be like very specific about how you're defining it. And then people tend to like, it's like, oh, what about my freedom to have a beer, you know? You have beer? You know, we're not stopping you from drinking it, but you gotta have it. You know, I don't know. I don't know how to express this in a way that's coherent at this point. I'm quite sleepy because I ate very late last night. One of the best known and most influential present-day treatments of liberty is that of Sir Isaiah Berlin. In his Two Concepts of Liberty, Berlin upheld the concept as negative liberty, absence of interference with a person's sphere of action, as against positive liberty, which refers not to liberty at all, but to an individual's effective power or mastery over himself or environment. Superficially, Berlin's concept of negative liberty seems similar to the thesis of the present volume. Liberty is the absence of physically coercive interference or invasion of an individual's person and property. Unfortunately, however, vagueness of Berlin's concept led to the absence of a systematic and valid liberty. One of Berlin's fallacies and confusions he himself recognized in a later essay and edition of his original volume. In his Two Concepts of Liberty, he had written that I am normally said to be free to the degree to which no human being interferes with my activity. Political liberty, in this sense, is simply the area within which a man can do what he wants. Or as Berlin later phrased it, in the original version of Two Concepts of Liberty, I speak of liberty as the absence of obstacles to the fulfillment of man's desires. Yeah. Yeah, that is not systematic. But as he later realized, one grave problem with this formulation is that a man can be held to be free in proportion as his wants and desires are extinguished. For example, by external conditions. That wasn't my critique. As Berlin states in his corrective essay, if degrees of freedom were a function of the satisfaction of desires, I could increase freedom as effectively by eliminating desires as by satisfying them. I could render men, including myself, free by conditioning them, losing their. desires, which I have decided not. Okay, that's not my book. Book I'm working. Maybe I should read Concepts of Liberty. Yeah, let's add that to the list. To Liberty. Isaiah Berlin. Okay. Oh. In his later 1960s, Berlin has expunged the offending passage, altering his first statement to political liberty in this sense is simply the area in which a man can act unobstructed by others. That's better. It's not perfect, it's still a bit rough around the edges. Yeah. But it's an improvement. But grave problems still remain with Berlin's later approach. For Berlin now explains that what he means by freedom is the absence of obstacle, possible choice and activity. Obstacle put there by alterable human practices. But this comes close as Professor Perrin confusing freedom with opportunity. In short, to scuttling Berlin's own concept of negative freedom and replacing it with legitimate concept of positive freedom. Thus, as Parent indicates, suppose that X refuses to hire Y because Y is a redhead and X dislikes redhead. X is surely reducing Y's range of opportunity. It can scarcely be said to be invading Y's freedom. Indeed, Parent goes on to point out a repeated confusion to Berlin of freedom with opportunity. Thus, Berlin writes that the freedom of which I speak is opportunity for action. 42 in bracket. And identifies increases in liberty with the maximization of opportunity. As Parent points out, the terms liberty and opportunity have distinct meanings. Someone, for example, may lack the opportunity to buy a ticket to a concert for numerous reasons, e.g. he is too busy, and yet he was still in any meaningful sense free to buy such a ticket. Thus, Berlin's fundamental flaw was his failure to define negative liberty as the absence of physical interference with an individual's person and property with his just property rights defined. Failing to hit on this definition, Berlin fell into confusion and ended by virtually abandoning very negative liberty he had tried to establish and to fall willy-nilly in positive liberty camp. More than that, Berlin, stung by his critics with the charge of upholding laissez-faire, was moved into frenetic and self-contradictory assaults on laissez-faire. As somehow injurious to negative liberty. For example, Berlin writes that the evils of unrestricted laissez-faire led to violations of negative, including that of free expression or association. Since laissez-faire precisely means full freedom of person and property, including, of course, free expression and association as a subset of property rights, Berlin has here fallen into absurdity, and in a similar canal Berlin writes of fate of personal liberty during the reign of unfettered economic individualism, about the condition of the injured majority, principally in the towns. Children were destroyed in mines or mills, while their parents lived in poverty, disease, and ignorance. A situation in which enjoyment by the poor and the weak of legal rights became an odious mockery. Unsurprisingly, Berlin goes on to attack such pure and consistent laissez-faire libertarians as Cobden and Spencer on behalf of such confused and inconsistent classical liberals as Mill and de Tocqueville. There are several grave and basic problems with Berlin's fulminations. One is a complete ignorance of the modern historians of the Industrial Revolution, as Ashton, Hayek, Hutt, and Hartwell, who have demonstrated that the new industry alleviated the previous poverty and starvation of the workers, including the child laborers, rather than the contrary. But on a conceptual level, there are grave problems as well. First, that it is absurd and self-contradictory to assert that laissez-faire or economic individualism could have injured personal liberty. Second, that Berlin is really explicitly scuttling the very concept of negative liberty on behalf of concepts of positive power or wealth. Berlin reaches the height or depth of this approach when he attacks negative liberty directly for having been no, but here it is. Used to arm the strong, brutal, and the unscrupulous against the humane and the weak. Freedom for the wolves has often meant death to the bloodstained story of economic individualism. Unrestrained capitalist competition does not today need stress. Crucial fallacy of Berlin here is insistently to identify freedom and the free market economy with its opposite, with coercive aggression. Note his repeated use of terms such as arm, brutal, wolves and sheep, and bloodstained, all of which are applicable only to coercive aggression such as has been universally employed by the state. Also, he then identifies such aggression with its opposite, involuntary processes re-exchange in the market economy. Unrestrained economic individualism led, on the contrary, to harmonious exchange, which benefited most precisely sheep. It is the latter who could not survive in the statist rule of the jungle, reap the largest share of the benefit from the highly competitive economy. Even a slight acquaintance with economic science is straight on this vital point. I'm gonna check something real quick on my. F.A. Hayek and the concept of Let's go. Hayek. I need to read Hayek at some. Actually, you know what? It's a long chunk to read. I am low on energy. So, proven. Why am I so sapped? Yeah, I'm gonna wrap things up here. I wish I could keep going, but you know, I'm slugging out. So, good night, boys. I will try to stream tomorrow, I guess. Tomorrow's... Well, I'll try. Good night. Have a good one, everyone.